Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I want to start this by saying there are many different layers to the battle for Britain's education, and there are many different phases in it. So now we're into new school wars, and I think we're in really complicated, often confusing territory, because the new battles are about choice and selection and the relationship between those two. And the second is about new providers in the landscape and the growing role of the private sector, which again, I think it's a feature of the new school wars that this is not discussed as much as it should be. Because in fact, that is the main change in our landscape. The third interesting element is about what I would call, and I think it's pedagogy, but I always think that's a rather sort of hard marble of a word, new learning styles in many of the schools. And the fourth is about transparency and public accountability for public money. So I think these are the four elements which I'm going to raise today. And I think many parents find it hard to grasp what these differences are about. But two things become clear looking at the Ofsted reports of ARC schools. And of course, remember, ARC is only one of the providers in the new landscape, and I think probably by far the best. The first thing is most of them are new. So they're full of the vim and vigour of new enterprises. And when I was writing my book, I went onto a lot of websites of new providers who haven't opened up a single classroom. And all of them, of course, are going to provide outstanding lessons. All their teachers are going to be of the highest quality and so on. And it made me end up feeling rather sorry for schools like my own daughter's, where they've been going for many years, been through many upheavals, many cuts, and it's still doing pretty well. But I think it's my point, which I mean in the nicest sense, it's easy to be outstanding at the beginning of your life. It's like when we have our babies, we all think these are going to be geniuses, and by the time they're two, we're a bit more realistic. Okay, and the second key element is resources. The thing that struck me about the ARC Ofsted was this is the product of a fantastic investment. Wonderful buildings, high quality teachers, smaller schools, catch-up provision for all, including lower and higher achievers. And I felt jealous. And I felt jealous because I have campaigned all my life for the state to provide that for all children. And that is what is at the heart of a genuine comprehensive vision. So academies have clearly been, whether it's the City Academy model under Blair, and I call him Lord Adonis now, or the Converter academies, clearly they are getting generous portions of state funding. My problem, Lucy, with your schools and their ethos is it's not so much the schools themselves. It's how they fit into the landscape nationally and locally, and where they situate themselves in public debate on a genuinely fair system. Non-selective schools in a highly selective, stratified landscape. To me, that doesn't make sense as a position in the schools debate. The second is that academies, like free schools, can be incredibly disruptive to the ailing local authority picture. And I know this because a local ARCA opened up a school down the road from me, and it's a primary school, and there was, and Lucy will be aware of this, an interesting article in the paper about how many people felt there wasn't consultation about the school, and that I felt very sorry for the heads of primaries in the area of Wilberforce School and Queen's Park Primary, serving truly disadvantaged population. A new school comes in with all these facilities, and it's, when you don't have local planning, when you have private providers entering into a local landscape, it just creates chaos. The charitable objects of ARC are to advance the education of the public in any part of the world as the directors may, in their absolute discretion, think fit. And I just thought it's benign and authoritarian. But my question here is simple. Where is the accountability? What if I, as a parent, do not like the school? What do I think if I'm not given fair treatment? What happens if my child is excluded? Academies and free schools do have special provision advantages, you could call it, in terms of admissions and exclusions. So I looked at some academies in my book, and I talked to people in a couple of very successful academies, and it's clear that these are very closed and often controlling cultures. I spoke to a teacher at one, he said, there's no question about it, children are getting a very, had an outstanding Ofsted, and I think we have to be fair about what they are achieving. He said it's quite a sterile environment, so that was one thing. He said the governors are part of the sponsor of the academy, appoints the governors. I wouldn't want to speak out against it. I can't tell you my name. He also said we have a lot of money that I don't understand where it comes from. And then in another academy, a friend of mine, as it happened, taught there, and she said, I found it a very cold place. It's obviously highly achieving, but I would not want to send my own children there. So I throw that into the mix. Sorry, but you know, it's important. Now, styles of learning. I go back to my point about academies. I, again, interviewed a parent. Child was chucked out of a comprehensive for behaving badly, went to an academy. This is what she said to me. He hates every single day of his education there. Okay, that's just, you know, I've met other people at the same school who didn't. But when it came to GCSEs, he got far better GCSEs than he would have got at a previous school. Now, I thought that was interesting. With my own children, good GCSEs hating every single day of their schooling. Of course, what we would like is that they should enjoy some of their schooling and they should do well. My fear is that there's no longer going to argue that the state should select, but we're going to come via all sorts of complex backdoor routes to selection by the market, selection through choice. And I think it will lead to a subtle stratification, but a definite stratification of our school system. And in every local area, there will be, in effect, the de facto grammar. Parents will know that. There will then also be the secondary modern. Parents will know that. And I would say that ARC, in many ways, provides high-quality secondary moderns, because I don't know, and Lucy may tell me this is the case, it seems to me that there's not a great social mix in ARC schools, because partly they're often in areas where the middle class and the very aspiration of going to grammars or faith schools or whatever. I think we'll also see much more niche schooling. Somebody said this week that Michael goes creating cottage industries. I mean, some of these schools are going to be rather unstable and small enterprises which will probably be swallowed up by a chain eventually, and the faith divisions, the minority faiths who have asked for their rights with the Anglicans and the Catholics. Is that the answer to the problem? No, I don't think it is. There may be many efficient schools in this new landscape, but the system will fundamentally remain divided in that completely English way where everybody knows their place. And this is a completely different vision from both the international vision, from the international one. The OECD says the more inclusive a school, the better it is, and that when you select and you stratify, you exaggerate the difference between the poor and rich. And it's a completely different vision from the original comprehensive vision, which I think still has an awful lot going for it, and we should fight for it. It needs the state involved, it needs genuine fairness, and it needs socially mixed and academically mixed schools.
On so many areas, we agree, and I think we start off from the same perspective, and we probably want the same ends. We just disagree about how we get there. So there is absolutely no question that ARC is all about creating good local schools which are embedded in their communities. And just to start by getting rid of some of the misconceptions that Melissa has, ARC is not a private entity, it's third sector rather than private sector. We are set up and funded by a philanthropic cooperative. There are no billionaires on that. Yes, there certainly are rich people from investment management, but that's not what we're about. We're about closing the achievement gap, and really passionately committed to doing that. At the moment we have 11 schools, but of the 8 that were open last year, 5 of them are old. We took over schools in some of the worst performing, poorest areas of the country, primarily in London, but also in Portsmouth and Birmingham. The 5 schools that we took over that were transition schools were schools of last resort. You didn't end up there on the whole unless you had to, or you had no other place to go to. Your school is a school of choice, and that's fine. It's a genuine comprehensive. I would aspire for all our schools to be comprehensive, although some of them are in areas that are sufficiently poor and not mixed communities that it is likely they will carry on having high proportion of free school meals. Sometimes it seems to me that the Anti-Academies Alliance are never clear which side of the argument they're on, that we get twitted for being sort of non-selective in poor areas and therefore having high proportions of free school meal children. And on the other hand, academies are endlessly accused of being selective. Again, to make clear, we use local authority criteria for admissions. It's based, other than the standard SEN and looked after children, it's based on distance from the school. We choose the schools on the basis of areas where we think we can make a difference. Just to talk then about the results, and saying, although they are poorer and less white than your schools, their results are on the whole better. Now, of those 5 schools which have so far reported GCSE results, with the exception of some of the very new ones, they're giving better results, and most critically, they're giving better results to the poorest children. But going on with the areas where we agree, on accountability, I think this is vital. One of my concerns about the current fast-changing environment is there's a lack of clarity precisely about the sort of mediating layer, that there is a risk that we end up with a situation which schools operating now as sort of islands unto themselves end up with very little between them and the deep blue sea but Ofsted. So on that, I'm sure we agree. I definitely think schools need to be held accountable. But the notion somehow that local authority accountability has worked effectively seems to me to be operating on the level of fantasy. We have very good relationships with the local authorities in which we work. But the schools that we took over had been operating for years, for decades, under local authority control, and they were miserable. They were failing schools. One of the schools we have was the 3rd worst school in the country. It had a 3% pass rate at GCSE. Had accountability like parent governors, local authority representatives. What difference did it make? I feel really frustrated at the idea that to have a sponsor coming in and doing the job that ARC has done, where those results have now gone from 3%, in the first 2 years they've gone from just over 20% to 39%. That's nowhere near where it needs to be, but it represents a sea change for that community. Again, on the separation and hierarchy of the system, I agree. It's not surprising that the UK school system reflects the hierarchies of a very class-bound society. We're trying to close that achievement gap. The ideal is the fully comprehensive school. And I think ours, again, we're not there yet because our schools are disproportionately representing the poor. We would like them to be more mixed environments, but one of the things we're doing is ensuring that actually all those children get a good education. Now, this brings me to the bit that I think is the missing link on both Melissa's argument and more generally the left. The left, it seems to me, has become enmeshed in an often fruitless battle over structures, an obsession with who's running schools, and they've left it to the right to monopolize the debate on standards, saying it's understandable in part. I think it's genuinely difficult, and I share her horror at some of the sort of vilification of good local schools. There is undoubtedly kind of not just media, but sort of middle-class hysteria about what it means to go to a good local school. It's hard to acknowledge sort of failure, that where schools aren't working, those are living organisms. You don't want to do down the efforts of, good people who are working in very difficult situations. It is undoubtedly the case that it's tough. If you're working in an inner city school with high levels of deprivation, that's not an easy job, and I certainly wouldn't want to do anything to do down those people. On the other hand, if you're not prepared to say that this is not good enough, you're actually failing those children. Now, based on Family of Schools figures for 2010, which is the latest ones that they had covering the schools, let's just compare the fate of a boy on free school meals at Melissa's school has a 1 in 3 chance in 2010 of getting 5 GCSEs, including English and maths. Now, you can say, I'd rather they were happy than had those qualifications. I have to say, I mean, this I feel quite passionate about. Tell that to that child who's got less than 5 GCSEs, who's leaving school at 16 and doesn't have the qualifications. It may matter less, I have to say, for our children, for the middle-class children, who get perhaps not such great. They can be sorted, they can get tutors, they will get into university. On the whole, class will out, and social capital trumps a bad education. The children who don't have those advantages and have failed, as I would say those free school boys are at that school, will not have that comfort. For the ARC schools as a whole, our pass rate has gone, the predecessor schools in 2006 averaged 22% pass rate at GCSE. Now, across the 5 schools, that's 62%. It's actually a higher percentage for free school meal children than it is for non-free school meal. Now, I don't want to push that too far because we're talking about still a relatively narrow band. So a lot of the children who aren't on free school meals are not themselves hugely wealthy. We don't have a huge middle-class population. But it's that commitment to closing the achievement gap and saying that standards matter, and if you don't engage with that, you're missing out the crucial part of the debate. That's my frustration with the left. I don't pretend that all academies are good. I don't pretend that academies are the silver bullet, that there's only one solution. I think there are many solutions. But what I would really like to see is the left engaging properly with the debate and sort of leaving behind some of the concerns about structures. The job that is being done in failing schools around the country is a really important one. The figures say, however variable, academies are increasing, and this is the traditional academies. I'm not talking about the converters or the free schools, which is another question entirely. The traditional academies are improving at a faster rate than their equivalents. That's all, and you need to engage at a sort of local level with what's good and what's bad. I don't want to see an academy that doesn't deliver results continuing to exist. I think they should be held to account, and we're happy to be held to account on that basis.
Now, social justice is a key agenda for us at RSA Education. As a sociologist of education, I'm very aware of the sociological work done in the 1970s, the key studies about state education's replication of inequality through the system. And I'd just like to ask what both of you think. Has state education in England particularly ever looked after the needs of the working class?
I was amazed when I was researching my book how much the state system does replicate class position, and that's why I ended with my worry that we're going to continue to do so. So I think it does replicate it, but I think we make advances, and I think the debate we're having here is, are Lucy schools making advances?
In general, one would have to say, of course, that no, it's tended to reinforce and replicate the existing class structure. It's not surprising. Most schools operate at a level where, you know, in a sense, what goes in comes out. There's relatively little value added. There are, however, and what sort of inspired our work was looking at the schools that have made a difference. And again, as I said before, I don't want to claim any monopoly on wisdom. Good schools are good schools are good schools. There are different ways of doing it. In our view, for the kind of children that we're talking about, there are some clear guides as to what makes a difference. And part of that is just a passionate belief that you can make a difference. One of my sort of shocks in coming to this, having been myself to a not very wonderful comprehensive, and seeing that you operate, saying there's often the assumption that sort of inclusion on its own is enough. The fact that you go to a genuinely mixed school is going to deliver benefits to working class kids seems to me a nonsense. I know sort of my school sort of average performance was not very good, but sort of more or less fine for the middle class kids. By the time you got to sixth form, it almost narrowed out to a point that mostly only middle class kids went through to the sixth form. The results that the kids got, in the working class children got at GCSE were pretty miserable, but overall it looked respectable. That's true in a lot of sort of North London boroughs at the moment, where they still have a tradition of genuinely comprehensive education, but they're not delivering. Now, going back to that point, saying if you look at what somewhere like Mossbourne has done, people are very snotty about Mossbourne, but again, just to be clear, looking at these figures which come straight from the family of schools, Mossbourne had 37% free school meals as against 22% at this school, had lower prior attainment intake. They've got, in their first A-level cohort, you'll have seen they got 10 Oxbridge offers. Half of those kids were on free school meals. Compare that to the results where you're talking...
I have to say about Mossbourne, some of the schools that do very well are finding a way to select a population that that they can do well with, and genuine comprehensives often are dealing with a sort of accretion of disadvantage. I went to see Lillian Baylis School in South London, 75% of children on free school meals. You know, you're talking about a completely different kind of position there, and a lot of that is because of the selection in South London. We just can't say it's all about what you're doing, although I accept standards are important. I definitely do.
Just to say, Lillian Baylis are consulting on becoming an academy in partnership with the RSA.
Everybody has to become an academy
but their admissions policy will not be changing, and they're absolutely committed to that.